United in the Word. I'm Candace, and this week's video is going to be on week 35 if you're reading through the Bible with us chronologically. We're going to start Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel is going to be weeks 35, 36, and just a couple of days in week 37. So I'm going to divide it up into two parts and cover most of it in week 35 and 36. And one of the things that I really like about Ezekiel, outside of the fact that it has a lot of great descriptive language about things that are happening in the unseen realm, is that week 35 and 36 falls for me in a period of time, because I start reading on January 1. It's almost fall. So anytime I know I'm getting into Ezekiel, I know fall is coming, and that's a really good thing. From where I live, summers are horrible. So this is a great time of year. And in addition, I really do like the week of Ezekiel that I get to read him, because he has so many things happening here. So let's talk first a little bit about Ezekiel. Ezekiel is one of the exiles who has found themselves in Babylon. And what we know about Ezekiel is not only is he a Levite, but he's from one of the descendants of Kohath, and then he's additionally a descendant of Aaron, which makes him a priest. And what we see in the first opening scene is the presence of God revealing himself to Ezekiel. Now, one of the questions is, what is the presence of God, Yahweh, doing, revealing himself to Ezekiel in Babylon? So we're going to touch on two different things this week. We're going to touch on the presence of God and the form that he takes on and how he travels. And then we're going to talk about what is happening that is strung through the first opening chapters of Ezekiel, which is just, I think, really interesting. First, let's talk about the presence of God. We know from other books, let's say Revelation, that any time the presence of God is in a place, it is surrounded by the cherubim. And we see that in the throne room scene of heaven. But the way God works, of course, if we're looking for it, we will also see it pictured when we see the presence of God descend for the Israelites at the tabernacle in Exodus. And we will also see the cherubim surrounded by God in the temple when Solomon builds it. And we're also going to see the presence of God surrounded by cherubim even when he's on the move. So what we see is God takes Ezekiel in a vision to Jerusalem, and he's showing him what is happening. And what is so interesting is that up until this point, the examples that we have of God's presence surrounded by the cherubim are when he comes to dwell among his people. But what we see in Ezekiel, and what I want to focus in on, is actually the withdrawing of the presence of God out of the state of Israel, because he is going to turn them over to the Babylonian conquest, and he actually is withdrawing his presence. So let's first touch on where we see him pictured coming to dwell among the Israelites, because it's when we see that picture, it's much easier to understand what's happening in Ezekiel. So the first place we see God coming and actually dwelling among his people is in Exodus. And specifically, it's in Exodus 40, verse 34 and 35, where it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle." That lets us know that the presence of God was this cloud that came in and filled it after all the items had been created and the temple had been created for the Israelites so that God could dwell among them. The second time we see this happen actually is in 2 Chronicles, when Solomon has finished his temple. And the verses that tell us use a lot of the same imagery and language. That is 2 Chronicles 7, 1 and 2. Now, when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. The priests could not enter into the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. Now, Those two examples show us how God's indwelling presence filled up the place that was created for him. And remember, he comes and sits on the mercy seat between what? The two cherubim. But now we have, as we're reading through Ezekiel, God revealing to Ezekiel the removal of his presence. It's no longer going to come in and fill the temple. It is leaving the temple. But what does it need to leave the temple? Well, the cherubim show up, and the cherubim show up on sort of a portable throne. So the presence of God is always surrounded by the cherubim, and Ezekiel sees this physical vision of the cherubim descending, and this is what happens with the presence of God. So in Ezekiel 10:4, it says, "Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub." This is the cherub that are sitting on the top of the mercy seat, okay, "to the threshold of the temple, and the temple was filled with a cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord." So we see that the presence rises up off of the mercy seat and goes and stands at the threshold of the temple. Well, what happens there? Well, the cherubim and the portable throne has already descended into Jerusalem and is waiting for the presence of God there. So the next verses, we see the presence of the Lord sort of catching his ride, if you will. And what it says is this, in Ezekiel 10:18 and 19, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And when the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings, rose up from the earth in my sight with the wheels beside them, and they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them." What we see at this point is we see now the presence of the Lord is on its portable throne. It's left the Holy of Holies, and it's now hovering over the temple's east gate. But that's not the last place we see it. Then we see it progress further outside, and it leaves the temple and goes into Jerusalem, and then it exits Jerusalem. And we see that here in Ezekiel 11:22 and 23. "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain, which is east of the city." So what we see in Ezekiel is not only the coming judgment on Jerusalem in the fact that they're going to be annihilated, the temple's going to be destroyed, and the Lord knows that's going to happen. So his presence must leave the temple before that happens. And Ezekiel shows us exactly. Why does the presence of the Lord appear in Babylon? It's showing Ezekiel that he has left the temple in Israel and that he has gone out surrounded by his cherubim. It is a very accurate picture of what happens. So next week, when we visit this again, we're going to talk about the second half of Ezekiel and what happens and when does the presence of the Lord return. So I hope this is something that you can catch as you're reading, you pay attention to that and you see what is going on behind the scenes. Thanks for stopping by. Hope you have a good week.